and then I can welcome our patient participant. So thank you for all for joining us to be patiently waiting for us. I know this is a very hot topic, so I was sure that nobody was leaving before. So good evening and welcome to the Armed Conflict in the 2020s, the crisis in Ethiopia's Tigray region, organized by the Washington Foreign Law Society. This is the first of a possible series of events on conflicts. Unfortunately, COVID has not stopped them. I'm Juliana Canet, the president of the Washington Foreign Law Society, founded in 1952 to promote knowledge and understanding of international legal matters, comparative legal issues, and foreign law. Given the number of participants, you will be muted during the webinar, but able to communicate with us via Q&A section. In addition to the question that you already kindly sent to us, to our panelists, please send questions via the Q&A section on your screen, and we'll get to those toward the end of the presentation. The session will be recorded. Let me introduce our speaker for tonight. I would welcome Michael, professor and Queen National Scholars, Department of History, Queen's University. Alex Dewal, Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation and Research Professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. You have their full bios in our website and on the invitation to this event. Let's maybe kickstart the event with a little bit of a context of what happened especially around November 2020, and to get some clarity, at least to get some basic facts. Professor Valdo Michael, if you want us to start, thanks.
Thank you, Juliana. It's a great honor to appear as your guest, especially to feature next to Alex, someone I greatly admire. Just before I start, I should make an important disclaimer that I speak on my own behalf as an academic. I neither have any sympathies nor antipathy against the TPLF, but I fully empathize with the Tigrayan people and will not sit idly nor quiet when egregious crimes are perpetrated against the Tigrayan people or any other people, civilians in Ethiopia for that matter, and Eritrean refugees there. Alex has a lot more important pressing things to say. So what I'll do in my presentation is to give a very wide context, because to understand November incidents of the morning of November 4th and November 3rd, it's important to understand the wider context of TPLF, EPRDF rule, as well as the Eritrean factor or the dynamics of relationship. So bear with me as I quickly read my notes on this, because I tend to digress. In 1991, a coalition of ethnic rebel movements called the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, with the help of Eritreans, toppled the Derg military dictatorship in the country. The genesis and growth of these ethnic movements reflect the nature of Ethiopia's political dispensation in the century prior to 1991. Upon their victory, these rebel movements became political parties, and they turned to ethnicity or ethnic identity as official organizing principle of the country's politics. Until early 2018, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, remained the most dominant, even hegemonic member of the EPRDF coalition. In the mid-1990s, the EPRDF government presided over the promulgation of the current Ethiopian constitution and formal restructuring of internal territorial and administrative structures along ethnic lines, or quote unquote nations, nationalities, and peoples, as the constitution put it. With such rigid provincial/ethnic identities and the inextricable association between ethnicity or ethnic groups and bounded subnational territories, subsequent tensions, grievances, and conflicts became essentially ethnic in nature, including the half-dozen low-intensity conflicts currently raging across Ethiopia, the full-on war in Tigray being the latest addition to that list, unfortunately. Meanwhile, EPRDF's 27-year reign is riddled with contradictions that came to haunt it. endangering the gains it made and altogether eroding Ethiopia's sovereignty. On the one hand, Ethiopia made dramatic socioeconomic advances by several measures. Massive local wealth was generated among previously disenfranchised communities. Education was vastly expanded, as were other services. And the country made overall steady progress, so much so that it realistically eyed joining the mid-income countries. But such gains of the developmental state were not without their own drawbacks, as was the idea itself. That is not something I'm going to dwell on today. On the other hand, a separate contradiction hamstrung the country's politics because federalism does not apply well in the context of centralizing party politics. Article 39.3 of the Ethiopian constitution stipulates that nations, nationalities, and peoples that constitute the federal states would have, quote, the right to a full measure of self-government, which includes the right to establish institutions of government in the territory that it inhabits, and to equitable representation in the state and federal governments, unquote. These are further elaborated in Articles 51 and 52 that prescribe the powers and functions of the federal and state governments, which is essentially the division of powers element of the Constitution. Federal systems are generally challenging in and of themselves. They became daunting in the Ethiopian context against the backdrop of enduring TPLF, EPRDF, radical leftist ideologies steeped in democratic centralism praxis. Whereas the decentralizing federal regional structures empowered local communities, the top-down political party structures that took precedence placed a glass ceiling on full implementation and dividends of federal principles. These political contradiction has contributed a lot to the ongoing unraveling of the gains that Ethiopia made in the 27 years of TPLF/EPRDF rule. Now, the elephant in the room is Eritrea's involvement in the current conflict. Between 1998 and 2000, Eritrea and Ethiopia, led by former allies, went into one of Africa's bloodiest wars. The actual fighting ultimately stalemated at the strategic level, but Ethiopia could easily absorb its losses, recover, and even appear victorious, flaunting international court's arbitral decision that favored Eritrea. In the ensuing decade and a half of quote unquote no war, no peace that TPLF-led Ethiopia was all too happy to keep, Eritrea's president Isaias Afwerki's consistent wrong moves domestically weakened and internationally isolated Eritrea. As a consequence of that, his lifelong sacrifices as an independence fighter since his early 20s were turned into a legacy of epic failure. Presiding over a government of a third that jailed its other two-thirds, newly independent Eritrea under his government turned into a shadow of its former self within 2 decades of its existence, and once held the unenviable position of being the third largest source of refugees next to Afghanistan and Syria. President Isaias blames the TPLF old guard for his and Eritrea's vicissitudes, and that is not without merit. TPLF leaders were on record stating that they were going to break the backbone of Eritrea, destroy the pride of one or another sector of its population, and they tried many things to that effect with some measure of success. This may be explained away as part of the deep level of political conflict, but then how other people take it depends on them. And the type that the Eritrean president is did not help the matter. The Eritrean leader's injury is particularly deep, and he has often characterized founding TPLF leaders as betrayers, as traitors, because the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, or EPLF, that he led, did in fact train, arm, and support those very figures when they launched their armed struggle in 1975, and eventually worked together to defeat the largest, most powerful army in sub-Saharan Africa in 1991. With Eritrea under his ever-tightening authoritarian grip, President Isaias played the long game to eliminate the TPLF, even at the cost of further ruining his country and weakening his regime. Nowhere is this more evident than in 2015, when then Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Haile Mariam Desalegn, discreetly communicated to him Ethiopia's readiness to fully implement the 2002 border ruling in return for ending hostilities and normalizing relations. Failing Isaias's test that he had set himself free from TPLF control, Haile Mariam's overture died as quietly as it was made. When Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed took office in April 2018, he revived that plan, but unlike Haile Mariam, he openly called for peace between his country and Eritrea. At the risk of simplifying the complex process and many actors, President Isaias's readiness to accept the extended hand rests on Prime Minister Abiy's distancing himself from the TPLF. The Dashinyang premier had reasons of his own to do exactly what Isaias needed to see. Abiy Ahmed publicly characterized his former bosses as daytime hyenas and Tsogur Luwit in Amharic, which would be chameleon or wolf, depending on the context, and said that the 27 years of TPLF/EPRDF rule was darkness, him being one of its products notwithstanding. The majority of TPLF leaders withdrew to their regional capital of Mekelle, where they remained ensconced for nearly 2 years when the current conflict started as a result. In his first formal positive response to Prime Minister Abiy's calls for peace, in June 2018, President Isaias Afwerki denounced the TPLF as, quote, vultures, scavengers, unquote, and declared game over. He has since remained consistent in rhetoric and action, and Abiy Ahmed went along with it in lockstep, scheming to eliminate the TPLF. From there, the rush to the night of November 3rd, morning of November 4th, is a matter of mere detail of twists and turns, with the cataclysmic ending remaining the same, or at least the start of the ending that we are witnessing today. The tragic irony of it all is that the changes that propelled Dr. Abiy Ahmed to power and touched off the process that culminated in this war were initiated by the people of Tigray themselves, who are now carrying its worst brunt. I can go into the details of this during Q&A, but I'm not giving the credit only to the people of Tigray at the cost of the sacrifices and bravery of the Keros and Fanos and many other Ethiopian reformists. The fact that the Tigrayan people were at the center of it, however, cannot be denied. All this is relevant because Eritrea is an integral part of the ongoing quagmire. Under unknown terms, Eritrea's military has been deeply involved in Addis Ababa, quote unquote, law and order operation since the start of the current war. Eritrea served as a launching pad to federal Ethiopian troops, and this came in different forms. First, there were troops who were in small numbers were being trickled into Eritrea, but not noticed internationally, although Eritreans noticed. Others survived the November 3rd, November 4th TPLF attack and flocked to Eritrea, fled into Eritrea, where they were received and rehabilitated or rested and reorganized. And then the third category was those who were flown into Asmara before the offensives started, into Asmara, Massawa, and Asab airports before the offensive started. As of November 7th, Eritrea's military supplied intelligence, carried out artillery bombardments, and took part in and even led some of the main infantry onslaught against TPLF positions deep into Tigray. Although the details about the exact units, personnel, and command remains patchy, the fact that Eritrean troops are carrying out the bulk of fighting in Tigray, and by extension, taking its brunt as well, is now beyond doubt. Not only are the agreements between President Isaias and Prime Minister Abiy unknown, but Abiy has been quiet about Eritrea's involvement in the current conflict. It is said that in private, Abiy Ahmed has been lamenting his inability to prevent Isaias from entering the war. ample factual and circumstantial evidence that contradict the Prime Minister's reported closed-door claims notwithstanding. Ethiopia's official silence means that Eritrea's involvement in the Ethiopian civil war can be seen as an act of aggression. Chapter 7 of the UN Charter and customary international law in general forbids aggression and stipulates cascading remedial measures against those who act such against a neighboring country. I will leave the remaining of the details of what went on and the various crimes that happened to Alex, and I hope I did not take too much time away from Alex. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I should start by apologizing for being slightly late today. It's been a very hectic day because the issue of Ethiopia has been raised at the UN Security Council under any other business. And the outcome of that meeting is not entirely clear as we speak. Let me start by with the 4 points, the 4 key points and demands that were made by the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, earlier this week, which were, interestingly enough, for the first time, repeated in a slightly different form in the presentation made to the UN Security Council by the Emergency Relief Coordinator and Head of Humanitarian Affairs at the UN, Mark Lowcock, just a couple of hours ago. And I will use those 4 points, first of all, to explain what is becoming clear about the extent of this conflict. And then I will move on to the proposed remedies at the UN Security Council. And as I say, as we speak now, it is not clear the extent to which those remedies will be actually possible to be enacted. So the first one is an end. Oh, let me run through the 4. An end to conflict, humanitarian access, international independent investigation into violations of international humanitarian law and other crimes committed, and the withdrawal of Eritrean troops. These are the 4 key points. And then I will go on to the possible route to a resolution, of which there are 2. One being that this is a threat to international peace and security, the other utilizing Resolution 2417, which is the UN Security Council resolution on armed conflict and hunger, which was adopted in May of 2018, so nearly 3 years ago, which was an unusual resolution, a thematic resolution, one that has never yet been utilized. There's never been a resolution building upon this generic resolution. So first of all, an end to the conflict. Now, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed never said this was an armed conflict. He said this was a law enforcement operation, and he declared it over on the 28th of November. The reality is that it is an armed conflict, and there are 4 belligerent parties. There is the Ethiopian National Defense Force, the Tigray Defense Force that is resisting. There are regional militias from the neighboring state of Amhara. There are also Tigray militias, but they are really under the Tigray Defense Forces. And there are the Eritrean Defense Forces that have which are there in very considerable numbers. The estimates for numbers for the Eritreans range from 60 to 90,000. So this is a major war, in fact. It is a war that is being fought with armored and infantry brigades. It was a war that was fought with drones until quite recently the armored drones have stopped. The cessation of attacks by armored drones coincided with the United Arab Emirates closing down a military base that it had in Eritrea. There's been no official recognition that the Emirates had any role in this, so I won't discuss them further, but we can discuss that in the Q&A. But there is no question that a war is continuing, that there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of casualties. There are ongoing military operations. I was speaking on the phone to a colleague in Tigray on Monday. And he was describing major military operations at that time involving 7 divisions, about 15,000 Ethiopian and Eritrean troops, which were involving hundreds of casualties. So it is a war, although the Ethiopian government refuses to recognize that it is a war. The reason why the Ethiopian government refuses to recognize that is it does not want to have to negotiate an end to the war. But the government of the United States, the United Nations, take a different view, and it is empirically the correct view. The second issue that was the demand was humanitarian access. This is an area that historically has been very poor, drought-prone, underproductive, reliant. Farmers there are reliant on other forms of income other than their farms, and there was a locust infestation last year, which is not entirely over. So it was a food insecure area, and according to the International Famine Early Warning Systems Network, it has massively deteriorated to the state of widespread food emergency. The government of Ethiopia claims that it is reaching the great majority of the people who are in need of food aid. The humanitarians who are on the ground, there are few of them. They have very limited access and an ability to speak, and those who are speaking are speaking in coded language because they are afraid of reprisals against them and against their local staff. They report that probably only 20% of the area can be reached. So there is a call, international call for unimpeded universal humanitarian access. And this is not just a matter of more permits being issued for individual aid workers. It's the ability to mount a comprehensive operation that can assess all the needs and provide for all the needs. That is simply not happening 4 months into this conflict. And that in itself, that delay is an egregious abuse. The Ethiopians are perfectly capable of mounting large-scale humanitarian operations very rapidly and at scale. They have not done so on this occasion. The third call is for international investigation into abuses of human rights, international humanitarian law. Many of you will have seen reports on CNN of a massacre at a church in Dengalet. There was the killing of perhaps 800 civilians by Eritrean troops in the cathedral city of Aksum back in November. There are ongoing abuses even as we speak. I was told of more civilian killings, large-scale sexual gender-based violence, and starvation crimes, destruction of objects indispensable for the survival of people, that is burning of crops, ransacking of food stores, looting of hospitals. Only something like 20% of the hospitals and clinics in Tigray are operational at all, and those are not operating at anything like full capacity. Destruction of water, supplies, and mass displacement of people. So already people, and that means children, are beginning to starve. And should there not be, number one, an end to this ongoing destruction of objects indispensable to survival, and that is a term of art in international humanitarian law. It is the term of reference in the Geneva Conventions for the use of hunger as a weapon of war. It is referred to in the Rome Statute of the ICC as a prohibited act. So a call which was repeated today at the UN Human Rights Council for independent investigations into these egregious crimes. The leaders of the Tigray government, which is now in a fugitive government in the mountains, they are calling this genocide. And in fact, there is good prima facie evidence to suggest that the intent, at least of the Eritrean army, is to destroy in whole or in part the Tigrayan community. I myself would be cautious in coming to that conclusion, but it's something we can discuss. And then last of all, the withdrawal of Eritrean troops. They are the majority of the troops that are fighting there. Their presence is not acknowledged. I think the lawyers will debate whether it could be considered an act of aggression, because they are indeed invited in tacitly by the government of Ethiopia. The command structures of the two armies have been integrated. And the Ethiopian army and the Eritrean army are not fighting one another. They're conducting joint operations against the Tigray defense forces. So in that respect, I would understand this as a non-international armed conflict against a domestic rebellion. But I would hope that the protection afforded to civilians in Tigray would be the same level of protection that should be afforded to civilians under an international armed conflict. Now, at the UN Security Council, it was raised, the issue was raised today for under any other business by the Irish. And it was raised with the intention of bringing a resolution under Resolution 2417. Now, 2417 was adopted nearly 3 years ago in recognition that the great majority of humanitarian emergencies facing the international community are brought about by armed conflict and by the deliberate use of starvation as a weapon. And what 2417 does is it has two essential elements. Number one is it's an early warning system. It says if there is armed conflict or these starvation crimes, and starvation crimes we can use as a sort of chapeau for all for crimes that are committed, the use of hunger as prohibited under the Geneva Conventions, under the Rome Statute, under the Genocide Convention, under any under human rights law as well. We can package them all together as starvation crimes. A recognition that when you have armed conflict and you have starvation crimes, the normal humanitarian early warning and response mechanisms are unlikely to work. And therefore we need to have, as it were, an emergency response outside the normal response. And the other thing that it does is it's a call for accountability. It's an accountability mechanism insofar as the UN Secretary General is required to report under the protection of civilians mechanisms within the United Nations. And it also makes it very clear that starvation as a method of war may be a war crime, and there should be accountability for that. Now, it's not clear what the outcome is today from this, from the discussions today, but the United States, which is chairing the UN Security Council this month, is bringing the matter up again, specifically under the rubric of 2417 a week from today. There will be a discussion of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen and a discussion of this humanitarian crisis and starvation crimes that are being perpetrated in Ethiopia today. And I would very much hope that that resolution would include all those elements. It is essential to end conflict, because that is what is driving the humanitarian crisis. It is essential to have humanitarian access, but that alone is not sufficient. There must be an investigation, and the Eritrean troops that are responsible for the majority of these abuses that we are currently witnessing and documenting should either be subject to very strict monitoring regulations so that they conform with international humanitarian law, or much preferably, they should be withdrawn. I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much. So, Professor Michael, would you like to respond to some of these very clear legal frame, or some of the discussion today at the Council? You're muted.
I'm sorry. No, these are pretty solid points. I don't have much to add, except express my dismay at the inability of the United Nations Security Council to see this for what it is and reach a consensus that would enable action. That is very frustrating. As a former refugee myself, as someone who is very close to what is going on the ground, that pains me greatly.
let me just add one point, which is that the argument that the government of Ethiopia is making for not wanting this to be raised is that it is an internal matter. It is a sovereign right of the government of Ethiopia to conduct its internal affairs and to respond to an act of rebellion. And indeed, it does have a sovereign right to respond to an act of rebellion. Its argument, however, the involvement of Eritrea and also the fact that this is affecting regional peace and security, I think, means that it is a matter it is a threat to international peace and security. And the fact that crimes have been committed by, it seems, all parties to the conflict, and I would not exempt the Tigray Defense Forces as well from that, means that it is a legitimate object, a legitimate subject for international scrutiny. One of the arguments made by the government of Ethiopia is that this should be handled at the regional level by the African Union. Unfortunately for them, what they did was there was the sub-regional organization for Northeast Africa, IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. The Ethiopians kept it off the agenda. There was an attempt by Sudan, which chairs the organization, to bring the Ethiopian case. They rejected it. The Ethiopians also rejected an African Union team of 3 mediators that went. And one of the interesting things, and the African Union has its Peace and Security Council, its version of the UN Security Council, obviously without the same legal authority. Now, after the case of the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, which you may recall, the Rwandese had a representation on the UN Security Council during the genocide, and they were able to speak and vote on all issues relating to Rwanda during that period, which was recognized as scandalous. The African Union adopted 2 things. One was a principle of non-indifference, which is like a precursor, the parallel to the responsibility to protect. And the other was a principle that within the Peace and Security Council, when a country is under discussion, it should not be present for those deliberations and it should not be able to set the agenda. Well, Ethiopia was on the Peace and Security Council in November and December, and it was present all the time and it set the agenda. So it prevented the case from coming to the African Union. As I mentioned, it rebuffed the mediators. So there is nowhere else for it to go but the UN Security Council at this stage. And if the Ethiopians are to speak to the other Africans and say, let us keep this within Africa, they have the other Africans, Kenya, Tunisia, and Niger, have a legitimate response, which is that if you wanted to keep it within Africa, you should have allowed it to be discussed, but you did not. Therefore, the correct place for this has to be the UN Security Council, and there are 2 legitimate mechanisms for bringing it, because it is an issue of international peace and security concern and egregious abuses of human rights have been perpetrated, including starvation crimes.
Thank you. You mentioned clearly 2 of the major, the UN Security Council, the African Union. There are many questions about the role of the international community beside these 2 actors. Do you see any other role for international organization or other country? And if so, what can be the response? Some of the question lean toward economic sanction. Do they work? Which other kind of intervention or sanction or measure can be taken?
Professor Awad, do you want to respond to that? Or okay. A number of countries are taking bilateral actions. So the European Union is suspending a budgetary support and other assistance to Ethiopia. The United States had already suspended, under the Trump administration, assistance because of a different dispute, which was to do with the Nile waters. And I think in that case, the suspension was not warranted. I think the US was acting very much incorrectly in that regard. But they have unlocked the suspension, the linkage of that suspension to the Nile waters issue, but they have kept the suspension without specifying what it is for. And I think it should be made clear what it is for. Presumably, it is to do with these 4 conditions relating to the conflict in Tigray. The other thing that some international donors are considering is because very substantial assistance has in the past been provided for development in Tigray. So if you go to Tigray, or if you went to Tigray a few months ago, you would have seen the University of Adigrat built to a significant extent with international assistance. You would have seen all sorts of development projects around the region. Those have been either destroyed or ransacked and looted, particularly by the Eritrean forces. And I was just hearing on Monday of a case that is a small but symbolically important case where they cut down a mango orchard. The cutting of fruit trees is the oldest prohibition on the books. It's there in Deuteronomy in the Bible. It was prohibited in the Islamic Code of Conduct for War. And these troops, when they came and they cut down a mango orchard, it has no military utility. It is there simply to punish people and to mean that they cannot support themselves. So some donors are considering, we will suspend our general assistance to Ethiopia, and we will target that assistance for reconstructing what we built in Tigray and what was destroyed by the Ethiopian National Federal Forces and the Eritrean forces. Then there are other measures that might be taken. One thing that would be a very logical step for the Security Council to do, if a resolution goes through, is to set up a panel of experts that would monitor the situation and recommend individual sanctions for individuals who are implicated in these crimes, pending or other sorts of abuses, including the perpetration of the war, which could be among any of the 4 belligerent parties, who could be individually sanctioned, in addition to which there could be an arms embargo, there could be other sanctions on Eritrea. Eritrea was under very steep sanctions for a range of reasons to do with its destabilization of the region. It got out of those sanctions after the agreement between Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed and President Isaias 3 years ago, and those sanctions could be reimposed.
If I can just add on that last point on pressure on Eritrea, I firmly believe that Eritrean troops being placed under stricter scrutiny would not cut it in terms of making a difference in the current situation. And so withdrawal of Eritrean troops is of utmost importance to see any hint of difference on the current landscape. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government depends very heavily on that. The bulk of the fighting continues to be done by Eritreans. So with Eritrean troops out of the equation, we can stand a chance of a negotiated settlement. And for that to happen, pressure needs to come directly to Eritrea. And in order for Ethiopia or for the federal government not to ease that pressure, in other words, becoming a sanctions buster, the same level of censure should be placed on Addis Ababa and Asmara simultaneously. Unfortunately, the balance of power, the security infrastructure has been totally disturbed in Tigray, which during the 2.5 years of the new prime minister's tenure remained the most stable part of Ethiopia. Now, none of these forces can be trusted with the security of the civilian population and Eritrean refugees in that region. And so the international community could also consider an international force. And this may be very difficult thing to swallow for the Ethiopian body politic, but it has been done in Sudan. There were 2 peacekeeping missions in Sudan simultaneously before 2011, and one only recently wound down in Darfur. So an international peacekeeping force in a sovereign country with a functioning government would not be unprecedented, and the international community would be best served, and the responsibility to protect would be promoted and enhanced if an international protection force is deployed.
Thank you. In this context, how do you see the, at least the US Secretary of State call for the Prime Minister? Do you think this can accelerate some kind of way out or solution, or in the meantime that we are waiting for the Security Council? How do you see this move?
One of the striking things about the dynamics of the relationship between Ethiopia and the United States and Europe is that Ethiopia is in an extraordinarily weak position because it is facing a number of simultaneous crises for which it needs international assistance and solidarity. And it's actually a remarkable turnaround, because 3 years ago, Ethiopians considered themselves in crisis, but they had several things, or Prime Minister Abiy had several enormous assets. Number one, the economy at that stage was booming. It was growing at something like 8% a year. It had doubled in the previous 6-7 years. Number two, he had good relations with all his immediate neighbors, with the exception of Eritrea, and was in very good standing internationally. Today, Ethiopia has very good relations, obviously, with Eritrea because of this military alliance. But there is an economic crisis, and they are in desperate need of a financial bailout and debt rescheduling. So the Bretton Woods institutions have a lot of leverage at the moment over Ethiopia. Ethiopia has lost its standing, its good standing with the United States, with China, which were its major donors and investors, and also with Europe. And also it is now in an antagonistic relationship with Sudan. Under the previous administration, essentially the strategy had been to build an African alliance to keep the Middle Eastern countries, Egypt and the Gulf countries, at bay, because they saw these as the strategic adversaries, the threats, particularly because Egypt wanted control of the Nile and therefore did not want Ethiopia to build dams on the Nile. One of the things that Prime Minister Abiy did was that he rushed into bargains, negotiations with Egypt and with the Gulf countries, particularly the Emirates, without really considering properly how he would deliver, how he would have leverage, and what would be the strategic outcome. The result was that he actually, as it were, threw away a strong hand on the Nile in particular, and found himself very vulnerable. And one of the consequences of that was that Sudan, which is the other main country on the Nile, which had been a strategic ally of Ethiopia, was forced into the Egyptian camp, because Sudan undergoing its own transition, has its own economic and political problems. It needed the support of the United States, and it needed the support of Egypt. And it was trying to keep the Egyptians at bay. It had no option when Ethiopia switched its policies. A question has been asked about the Al-Fashaga region. Now, the Al-Fashaga is a disputed border area between Ethiopia and Sudan. Now, across Africa, most boundaries are very arbitrary lines. They are drawn in ways that do not reflect the reality of where people live and what are the boundaries between communities. And this is no exception. And the legal boundary, which is accepted really by both sides, puts substantial numbers of Ethiopians as villagers, as settlers, as farmers in Sudanese territory. Now, because of the wider strategic concerns of friendship between the two countries, Ethiopia and Sudan had said, we're not going to make this an issue. We're going to live and let live. We will allow the official border to be here, but the de facto border to be somewhere else, and allow these Ethiopians to continue there. Unfortunately, because of the rapid deterioration in relationships between the two countries, this became an issue, and it became a particular issue when the Ethiopians asked the Sudanese army to close the border because they said there's going to be a war in Tigray. And so the Sudanese army moved to that border, and they rather brutally removed the Ethiopians who were living there, causing a problem. But it was an entirely unnecessary problem, and it is now escalating into a very serious standoff. And just earlier this week, the Sudanese and the Egyptians made a military pact, and it is and that is being cemented even as we speak, the end of this week. And it is quite possible that the Egyptian army may now be deployed in Sudan, and this would be a significant escalation of a regional regional confrontation, and another reason why it's important for the UN Security Council to deal with this. As I say, I don't think this came about through design. I think it came about through blunders on each side, which is very often the way that border wars start and escalate.
On that point, on the question of Secretary Blinken's statement, what role it could have, what we see is a new administration, a new approach to a region that the United States has or had strategic interest and deep involvement. We see, and this is coming on the heel of a 4-year of total blunder of the previous administration, not just absence, but total disastrous blunder. And so what we see in the United States seeking multilateral engagement, but at the same time interest to get back into the game of geostrategic rivalries in the Horn of Africa and across the Indian Ocean region. This cannot be a separate issue. It's part and parcel of the global geostrategic rivalry between the superpowers. And this ties nicely with one of the questions that is being posted currently, that just got posted, regarding the role of China. China is an important player, has proven itself to be an important player. And yes, it has loaned a significant amount of money to Ethiopia, although its role in Eritrea is a lot minimal, or at least we do not know it. Its presence in China has gone toe-to-toe with the United States, if not as much as France. And we have seen from the Kibaki years in Kenya to Meles Zenawi's period in Ethiopia, that China has proven a reliable alternative when US pressure on these governments had been too intense on one or another issue. So these countries in East Africa sought alternative sources of support or financing, and China was there. So I am not sure that Dr. Abiy Ahmed and his government is going to go that way. But the fact that the difficulties that his government has had so far to restructure Ethiopia's massive debt may, and added to that, the potential pressure that Anthony Blinken's letter may indicate, that might push Abiy Ahmed's government more toward China. But in the overall balance of power, the United States has had a long tradition of strategic presence in the Horn of Africa, and it seems intent to restore that place.
Thank you so much. So in the time flies, and we, as you see, we were loaded by questions both offline and online. Of course, if you want to pick up some questions, but my last question before we close, I would like to be a little bit more, uplifting. Like, if you want to see the situation, let's say we do the panel in 2 years, what is your best case scenario for these conflicts and the way out of it, and what you wish for the region and actually for the larger region, because we saw that we have spillover effects. So please.
If I could go first on that, I think that what we see here is it looks a little bit like a provincial conflict, but actually it has a far wider ramification, both in terms of destabilizing a very crucial area of the world, not just the Horn of Africa, but the other side of the Red Sea as well. But also it raises a lot of very, very pivotal questions about the norms, principles, and institutions that govern the world order. The relationship, the basic principles that animate the African Union, which are to do with democracy, the obligation to offer and to accept good faith mediation, conflict resolution, the principle of non-indifference to gross abuses of human rights, and then the relationship between the United Nations, its key member states, and the African Union. And I think what, in a way, we look over the abyss. In this case here, what we see is the potential, the terrible potential of a world without norms. What happens when you get an actor such as President Isaias Afwerki, who has no regard for norms and principles, just ruthlessness, and who is able to have his way, and the spread of transactional politics more broadly. And I think the best case is that we look over this abyss, we draw back, and we recognize the need for a collaborative reconstruction of this multilateral rule of law architecture at the regional and global level in order to restore the rule of law.
I may do political analysis and I may have studied some international law, but I'm a hardwired historian, and I just don't talk of what might happen in 2 years or in 2 weeks. But let me mention a couple of things that have been raised that are very important in and of themselves, and certainly relevant to the question of what would happen in the next 2 years or 2 months. First of all, what is happening inside Eritrea cannot be separated from what is being done to the people of Tigray, irrespective of who is perpetrating these crimes. And these crimes are far-reaching and are happening in more than one place or a few places. One is Eritrea has lived under a year-long total lockdown under the guise of COVID restrictions. And these restrictions may have been lifted in the capital city, but various aspects of it have progressively been tightened. These restrictions have been in place to begin with as part of the authoritarian government's control over the population, so that it could do what it has always done, which is whatever it does in terms of regional and domestic adventurism, and not so much with health, because you see a void, a total void in health policies that are meant to mitigate the COVID spread and vaccine introduction. None of that is being put in place. So the COVID restrictions are part of the state control to enable it to blindfold the Eritrean population and to enable it to do whatever it wants. And this is its adventures in Tigray is exactly that. The other question is, I'm sorry, maybe you can hear in the background my child crying, but that's the story for everyone, I suppose. The second point that has also been raised is the potential independence of Tigray. This is an issue that has been raised seriously and publicly during the elections that were carried out in Tigray in September 2000, the regional elections. But the constitution also demystified the idea of independence by stipulating very clearly that these nations, nationalities, and peoples have the right to self-determination, including secession. But it has specific stipulations that could not happen under the current circumstances. which is that the parliament, 2/3 of the regional parliament would vote for independence, and then within 3 years or within a certain set period, the government, the federal government that is, would hold a referendum in which all Tigrayans would vote. Upon favorable vote, then the federal government would pass on the authorities, and then that region would assume sovereignty. So that could not happen, number one. Number two, there are practical problems in terms of what exactly is Tigray in terms of its territorial and demographic limitations these days. And I bring this up because the 1994 regional restructuring and 1995 constitution included into Tigray parts that other regional states claim as their own. So I don't want to lend legitimacy to TPLF is doing that, or the claims of the others to those territories. But the reality right now is that the southeastern part of Tigray has been, the Raya area, has been taken up by Amhara militia as part of the former Wollo province, and Western Tigray is currently occupied by Amhara militia, and it's been claimed as part and parcel of Amhara. So this is a situation of what I call domestic regional irredentism. So demographically, the people there have not been heard right now, whether they want to be with Tigray or with Amhara regions. But for that to happen, there needs to be peace and a return to what existed before the war. A unilateral declaration of independence on the part of Tigray would be the least advisable course of action. Look at Somaliland. Somaliland, in the whole Horn of Africa region, it has by far the best record in terms of democratic, political, and economic development. Yet it's not officially recognized because Mogadishu, the central government, the non-existent, even let alone today when Mogadishu somehow has semblance of existence, even at a time when there was no central government to speak of in Mogadishu, still Mogadishu had the upper hand on whether Hargeisa could be recognized as a sovereign country or not. Eritrea became independent because Addis Ababa granted the green light. South Sudan became independent because Khartoum granted the green light. Without Addis Ababa willing to do so, Tigray would face the same problems. Unfortunately, the same problems as Somaliland. Unfortunately, it does not have the advantages of Somaliland. It will remain encircled by hostile neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know we have so many more questions, but not time to answer. This was a very timing panel, not only because the issue is quite serious, but also because, as we see, the international community is not yet responding, but we are also part of the international community. So you have contributed to a possible answer or clarity. And so I want to thank you for that. I thank you all the registered people, and I see you in another occasion soon, maybe with good news. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a good evening. Bye.